Hey, Friday afternoon vlog, designer, developer partnerships. So I'm going to read this post that was sent to me through the Killer Sites forums. I've been a developer for greater than 20 years and I want to go into freelance. The problem is that my design skills are very raw. Therefore, I believe I would greatly benefit from partnering with a good designer. I have some questions though. What percentage of pay is typically fair for both parties, and how does one decide? To me, development seems more difficult and time consuming than design, so I would see a larger split going towards the developer. However, I could be wrong about the time and difficulty. Plus, it's crucial to have a good design. I just want to be fair to both parties. So that's good. When you're going into any partnership, it's good to have goodwill, meaning the intention is to have a fair outcome for both people. Long term, that's the better approach rather than trying to get one up on your potential partner. I highly recommend that you operate in this way if you want to have long term, good relationships with people that you deal with, whether they're partners or clients, etc. Try to be fair. You're not going to always get the reciprocal, but nonetheless, it's a good approach. I'll answer this question in a second. So let me get to point number 2 before I get to the answer. Is it common for one party to find the work and then negotiate the dollar value for farming out the work? For example, if a designer finds a client, would he or she then offer a dev a certain amount without disclosing how much he or she is getting from the client? And question number three, what are the typical roles for both parties? I read an article that said that the designer usually works more closely with the client than the developer, which makes sense. Number 4, what else should I know about partnerships? These are very good questions. So let me just say that a lot of times in business, there are no real written in stone rules because it all depends on the circumstances. So let me just deal with the last question. He said, what are the typical roles of both parties? I read in articles that designers usually spend more time working with clients than developers. It depends on the type of project. If the project is more visual oriented, let's say it's a website where there's a lot of visual components to it, but not too much back end, then of course, yes, you're going to see much more client with designer. On the other hand, I've worked on many projects where the design aspect of the work was minimal in comparison to the software development. So I'll give you an example. One time, actually the very last freelance gig I ever did, way back about 800,000 years ago, and I took the project because a friend of mine was doing the design, and he got the contract. Well, he got the original client contact, and they would only give him the contract to build the visual component if there was a back-end programmer to do the work for in that regard. That was a more important aspect for this particular client, the back-end work, the application development as opposed to the design. So my friend came to me, Steph, please do this gig for me, please, please. I want to get this contract. It's a good contract. Even though I had at that point hung up my nerd freelance hat and I was doing my own SaaS development, I said, okay, for you, I'll do it as a favor. Most of the work for this particular project was back-end stuff. Essentially, for this particular job, they were a small business, maybe 10, 15 employees, and everything they did was using Microsoft products, Microsoft Office, Excel, Word, and a bunch of other things. And they wanted their website to be updatable through Excel drops on the server. So essentially, they would track all their product information inside of spreadsheets, and then Excel spreadsheets. And then they wanted to be able to just upload a spreadsheet to the server, have the system read the spreadsheet, grab the information from that spreadsheet, and present it on the website, and a whole bunch of other things as well. The design component was really 20% of the contract, maybe. It was mostly back-end coding. So as such, in this particular situation, I was the go-to person. I was the one who was always talking to clients because that's where most of the work was. On the other hand, if it's a project where it's mostly web design, UX, UI, with maybe a back-end portal that you might implement either with WordPress or Drupal or some CMS like that, or maybe some minor custom job, then most of the work might be designed in that situation So in that situation, of course, the designer is going to be spending more time with the client. So this third question, he said he read an article said that most of the designers were usually spending more time with the clients. That's a ridiculous statement. It depends on the project. So let's go back to question number 1. What percentage of pay is typically fair for both parties, and how does one decide? To me, the development seems more difficult and time-consuming than design, so I could see a larger split going to developer. However, I could be wrong about this. Again, short answer, depends on the project. You have to judge the amount of hours the developer has to spend versus the designer, which again depends on the project. It also depends on how advanced the design, UX, UI is in the particular project. UX is user experience. UX is short for user experience. UI is user interface. What you see, the aesthetics, what makes it look pretty, it's UI, it's user interface. Then UX is kind of user experience. It's kind of, in a nutshell, if you don't know what UX is, it's kind of like information design, if you will, in terms of nomenclature, where you place things on the page. UX experts are good ones are few and far between. It's an art as much as it is a science, I would argue, to a certain extent. It really depends on a lot of experience and judgment. I spend a lot more time personally working on UX because UX, in my opinion, has to be spot on, whereas the back-end design, for most projects, you can have a rough and tumble, not necessarily perfect code that's not super efficient these days for most projects because servers are so fast, programming languages, whether it be Python, PHP, Java, Ruby, C#, except for Ruby. Okay, that's just a bad Ruby joke. You don't know my channel here. I make fun of Ruby every now and then just because it's what we do. Ruby's fine. But regardless of the back-end language, server-side programming languages, and we're talking about the web stack here, web development, web design, server-side programming languages are so fast these days, and servers are so fast these days that having super optimized code as we used to have back 10, 20 years ago, for most projects, you can get away with really crappy code and you can satisfy 99.9% of project requirements in terms of resource utilization, in terms of how efficient the server is. That being said, I make no secret of it. For me, for most projects, in terms of the web stack, I'm a big proponent of PHP simply because PHP is easy to learn, easy to get up and running with, is far more performant than Ruby or Python on the server. In terms of CPU and RAM resources, it really is. It's far more performant. So you can get a lot more bang for your buck in terms of server CPU vis-a-vis PHP relative to other languages like Ruby or Python. I'm not dissing on Python or Ruby. I'm not insulting them. It's just the fact of the matter is. Sorry about that. I was interrupted by a phone call. So yes, just to wrap it up, you could build good web apps in any of the server-side programming languages, whether it be PHP, Java, Ruby, Python. It doesn't matter. Whatever you prefer. Again, it's just PHP is very performant in terms of resource allocation. It requires less CPU and RAM than the other languages last time I checked, especially with PHP 7. But anyway, use whatever language you prefer. So to answer his number 1, what percentage of pay is typically fair for both parties? How does one decide? Depends on the scope of the work, depends on the complexity of work, depends on whether the job is more dependent on the back end coding versus the front end. Now, in terms of UI and UX, if you have a very talented UX person, they're going to charge premium dollar, which is equal to developers. If they're the average designer, it's going to be less than the back-end programmer. That's just the fact of the matter because there's a perceived barrier to entry that's higher. I say perceived barrier to entry that's higher for back-end developers. That's why I advise people, if you're going to get into the game as a freelancer, I say learn a back-end language because you're going to get a lot more jobs, first of all, and you're going to be perceived as being more valuable because there's that barrier to entry. Whereas design, even though good designers are few and far between, especially UX people, because design is perceived as being easier to get into because you can get Photoshop or some other design program and really put out crappy designs, but unless you have sophisticated clients who understand the difference between good design and bad design, and UX especially. UX is very black box for a lot of people. They won't see that. Now, if you're a great UX person and UI person, you'll get top dollar. Like I will pay top dollar for UX UI people because I know that they're valuable. Number two, is it common for one party to find work and then negotiate a dollar value for farming out the other work? Again, it all depends. It all depends on how you structure your business. If you have a regular client that you deal with on a regular basis, you're a back-end developer, and now they need some nice UI work, then you could do that. You could partner with a designer and say, well, how much do you charge per hour? Let me see your work, make sure they look good. And then you show in the project, and you say, okay, how many hours do you think this is going to take? And you can handle it that way, where you are the company that bills your client, and then you just subcontract to these guys. So the designer doesn't deal directly with the company, except for maybe just batting back and forth design ideas and so on. But you have to, typically when you subcontract to other freelancers, the etiquette is that whoever is subcontracted to doesn't try to do a runaround and try to deal with your client directly. If they do that, they're bastards. So most will, if they're smart, because they're going to want to deal with you in the future. So again, how you negotiate depends on the scope. But if it's mostly UX, let's say you got a contract with a client and they approach you and like 80% of the job is UX, UI, again, you could choose to, farm it out to the designer, and then, you get a quote from them, and then you just resell your time to your client with a bit of a markup. You got to make some money. Or you could just say, listen, I'll refer you to my client and I take this percentage. It depends on how you want to arrange this, right? This is a question that comes up all the time. I know this is not a super cut and dry answer, because it fluctuates quite a bit depending on the situation. So, final question, what are the typical roles of both parties? Okay, I answered that one. So what else should I know about partnerships? Well, you could, when you first go into any partnership with anybody, it's like a marriage, right? So you got to be very careful about it. You should date them first, make sure you know them, make sure you trust them. I would do a few collaborative projects where you're not joined at the hip. You don't work under the same company. You just subcontract to this other person. And this way, if you find out that you don't get along with them, or whatever problems arises, there's no big deal. It's like no issue to not work with them again. Enter into partnerships with extreme caution. Partnerships breaking up and going to court and battling is cliche. It's very common. So you want to be very careful about that. What I would suggest that you do is that you establish relationships. Let's say you're a developer. You establish relationships with some UI and UX people that you know or get to know. Find out what their rates are. Say, listen, if I have UX, UI jobs to take on, what's your rate? And establish a working relationship and say, listen, you just tell me how much you're going to take. You bill me, and I'll deal with the client. And most people, by the way, that's how they're going to want to do it. They're not going to want to deal directly. If they do, then you may want to pick somebody else, or maybe you just tell your client, say, listen, I got a UX, UI guy. This is my suggested person. You can deal with them directly. They may want to. Your client may want to deal with them directly. They may not want to. It all depends. So you have to sort of work that out. At the end of the day, my only advice is evaluate the percentage based on the type of job it is. Is it much more of a UX, UI job, then the bulk of money, of course, is going to go to the UX, UI person. If it's much more of a back-end job, if you're a developer, then the opposite. How sophisticated the back-end work is also plays a role, and how sophisticated the front-end work in terms of the design plays a role in terms of who gets the bulk of the money. At the end of the day, it comes down to hours. How many hours are you going to spend on this project as a developer versus how many hours the designer is? There's also, as a freelancer, you also got to get a taste for securing the client. What I mean by taste, you get a finder's fee at the very least. if it's your client. Managing the project, it costs money. So if it's your client and you hire a UX UI person to do the UX UI part of the project, but you're managing the whole interaction, you get a premium, and because you're managing the whole thing, besides the fact that you're a client to begin with. So there's all these factors that get into that. Good question. What I would suggest, step one, determine the scope of the project, whether it's UX UI, whether it's back-end centric, how complex is UX UI. If it's simple UX UI, what is it worth, right? But if it's very advanced stuff where the client is very specific about what they want and so on, and there's a lot of information architecture in that regard in terms of the front end, it has to be done, then these people with those skill sets are more rare than just your typical designer type. Or on the flip side, if the back end is very simple, then it is what it is. Or if it's very complex, it is what it is, right? So it really depends on what you're going to do. I've seen projects where the front end, the budgets are very small in terms of design and UX. They don't really care too much about UX. They don't understand it. It's like a simple site. So that's worth what it is. Whereas the back end is more complex. And I've been on the opposite where most of the job is really UX UI. So these guys the UX UI person is making the bulk of the money. So there you have it. I hope this clarifies. There's a lot to take in. A lot of this is situational. A lot of this depends on your relationships, depends on your own experiences, depends on how you want to handle the jobs. There you go. I hope it helps. All right. Talk soon. Bye.